There is a very particular moment that takes place within an avoidant person, a moment that most of them will never openly talk about, rarely acknowledge even to themselves, and almost never allow you to see happening in real time. It does not happen immediately after you become silent. In the beginning, their defenses are still active. Their mind is still creating explanations that make the situation feel safe and predictable. They tell themselves that your distance is temporary, that eventually you will return, that the old pattern between you has only paused and has not truly changed. They believe the connection is still operating under the same rules it always has. But then time passes. The silence continues. The reaching out does not happen. The person who once carried the emotional weight of the connection decides they are no longer willing to keep chasing, convincing, waiting, or proving their worth to someone who constantly moved the line of emotional availability further away. And when that reality finally becomes impossible to ignore, something inside the avoidant begins to shift. What happens inside them is not a simple feeling of missing someone. It is not a straightforward experience of loss where everything suddenly becomes clear. It is much more complicated than that. It becomes an internal conflict between different parts of themselves that were never prepared to meet each other. Their pride fights with their longing. Their desire for connection clashes with their fear of vulnerability. Their ego struggles against the uncomfortable emotions they have spent years avoiding. Their shame rises alongside the realization that something important may have slipped away. And at the heart of this emotional collision is a feeling they struggle deeply to accept. The realization that you humbled them without attempting to hurt them. You did not defeat them through an argument. You did not force them into a corner. You did not try to make them feel rejected. You simply chose yourself. You valued your own peace enough to stop participating in a connection where you were constantly the one trying to hold everything together. And that simple act can create a powerful emotional impact. Today, I want to take you deeper into what may be happening on the other side of that silence. Not because you need their reaction to validate your decision, but because understanding the psychology behind it can bring you a different kind of peace. It can help you understand what changed, what your silence actually represented, and most importantly, how much you transformed while learning to stop abandoning yourself for someone else. And yes, there may be a small part of you that feels some satisfaction, knowing that someone who once took your presence for granted may finally recognize your value. That feeling is human. But the deeper purpose is not revenge. The deeper purpose is awareness. It is recognizing the strength you found when you stopped trying to convince someone to see what was already in front of them. To understand what happens inside the avoidant after your silence, we have to begin with an emotion that is rarely discussed but plays a major role in their behavior: embarrassment. Embarrassment is one of the hidden forces that can influence an avoidance response after losing access to someone who is always emotionally available. Many conversations focus on fear, independence, or emotional distance, but they often overlook the uncomfortable feeling that appears when the image they created of themselves begins to collapse. An avoidant often develops a very specific identity within relationships. Deep down, they may carry the belief that they are the person who has more control, the person who can stay detached, the person who can walk away if things become too intense, the person who does not need anyone too much. This belief is not usually spoken directly. They may never consciously say, "I am the one who cares less," but it is reflected through their behavior. It appears in the moments when they pull away without explanation. It appears when they offer closeness and then suddenly create distance. It appears in the pattern of giving affection and then withdrawing it when intimacy begins to feel overwhelming. The message communicated through these actions is subtle but powerful. I decide how close we become. I decide when I am available. I decide when the connection feels comfortable enough to continue. And for a long time, that belief can feel true, especially when you are the one reaching out, when you are the one trying to repair things, when your desire for closeness is more visible than their desire for connection. As long as you continued moving toward them, their internal story remained protected. They could convince themselves that they were the stronger one emotionally. They could believe they were the person with less attachment, less need, and less vulnerability. Your silence changes that entire dynamic, not because you attacked them, not because you gave them a dramatic speech, not because you demanded that they finally understand your pain. You simply removed your energy from a situation that was draining you, and that is what makes it so powerful. There was no argument for them to fight against, no accusation for them to defend themselves from, no emotional explosion that allowed them to focus on your reaction instead of their own behavior. There was only the quiet reality of your absence. Suddenly, the person they assumed would always be there was no longer reaching. Suddenly, the person they believed was more emotionally invested was the one who stepped back. Suddenly, the person who had always seemed available was showing that they could choose themselves too. And this creates a deeply uncomfortable realization for the avoidant. The identity they built around being the person who needs less begins to crack. The person who believed they were completely in control begins to feel the discomfort of uncertainty. The person who thought they could leave whenever they wanted begins to experience what it feels like when someone else chooses to stop chasing. That is where the embarrassment comes from. It is not simply embarrassment because they miss you. It is deeper than that. It is the uncomfortable awareness that the dynamic they depended on changed because you finally stopped playing the role they expected you to play. The person they thought would always come back did not. The person they thought would continue proving their love did not. The person they believed they had emotional power over quietly reclaimed their own power. And sometimes, that realization is the moment when the avoidant begins confronting feelings they had been able to avoid for a very long time. The most uncomfortable part for the avoidant is the private realization they never wanted to face. The story they created about the relationship was not completely true. They were not as unaffected, detached, or emotionally untouchable as they believed themselves to be. The person who thought they had all the control may suddenly have to face the possibility that they cared more than they admitted, that they relied on your presence more than their identity allowed them to accept, that they may still feel a need for the connection they once convinced themselves they could live without. And what makes this realization even more difficult is the way you handled it. You did not create chaos. You did not demand answers. You did not chase them down and force them to confront what they were avoiding. You simply stepped away. You left with a level of calm and self-respect that they may not have expected from you. You responded to the situation with a dignity that was completely different from the emotional pattern they had become comfortable with. And inside avoidant psychology, there is something especially confronting about being met with grace by the person you failed to show up for. Because now there is no easy way to dismiss your actions. There is no dramatic reaction to blame. There is no emotional outburst they can point toward and use as proof that leaving was justified. There is only the quiet reality that someone they assumed would keep trying eventually reached a point where they chose themselves. And that realization can create a deep sense of embarrassment. It stays with them. It bothers them. It challenges the version of themselves they have worked so hard to maintain. But embarrassment is not the only emotion that can appear after your silence. Another powerful reaction is anger. And I want you to understand this clearly, because this is where many people become confused. They see anger from the avoidant and immediately assume they must have done something wrong. They believe the anger means their silence was cruel, unfair, or a mistake. But often, the anger is not actually about what you did. The anger comes from what your silence changed. The avoidant may feel angry because you disrupted a pattern they had become comfortable with. A pattern that was never openly discussed or mutually agreed upon, but one that slowly formed through their behavior and your continued willingness to participate. There were invisible rules inside the dynamic, the rule that you would always be available, the rule that you would eventually come back after distance, the rule that your desire for connection would remain stronger than their desire to withdraw, the rule that they could maintain emotional space while still having access to your care, attention, and presence whenever they wanted it. Your silence broke all of those assumptions at once, and that can feel deeply unsettling for someone who had unconsciously built their sense of security around that structure. The anger is often the first protective response because accepting the truth underneath it would be much harder. It is easier to feel frustrated at you than to admit what your silence is revealing. Because if they become honest with themselves, they have to face uncomfortable questions. Why does your absence bother me this much? Why did I assume they would always be there? Why did I believe they would continue offering love while I continued creating distance? Why does their decision to protect themselves feel like a rejection of me? Those questions lead somewhere much deeper, and that place is often difficult for an avoidant to enter. The anger becomes complicated because they cannot fully justify it. Deep down, they know you did not do anything wrong by stepping away. You did not punish them. You did not take something from them. You simply stopped giving endlessly to a situation that was leaving you emotionally exhausted. To openly express anger would require admitting something uncomfortable, that they expected your loyalty, patience, and emotional availability while offering less security in return. That realization can conflict heavily with the image they have of themselves. Many avoidant people want to see themselves as fair, reasonable, and emotionally aware, but acknowledging that they feel upset because someone stopped chasing them forces them to confront a sense of entitlement they may not want to recognize. So the anger has nowhere comfortable to go. They cannot fully place it on you because there is no real wrongdoing to point toward. They cannot easily turn it inward because true self-reflection requires emotional honesty and vulnerability. Instead, it remains inside them as an uncomfortable mixture of frustration, confusion, and discomfort. A reminder that something they thought they controlled was never completely under their control. But underneath the embarrassment and underneath the anger, there is another emotion that matters even more. Something much softer, something much more painful. Grief. Real grief. Not just missing a person out of habit, not simply feeling uncomfortable because a familiar source of attention is gone, but grieving the loss of something meaningful that they may not have fully appreciated until it was no longer easily available. This is one of the most complicated emotional experiences for an avoidant, because grief requires something they often struggle with, admitting that something mattered. To grieve someone means acknowledging their value. It means accepting that their presence had an impact. It means admitting that the connection was not as replaceable or insignificant as they may have convinced themselves. And that directly challenges the belief system built around independence and emotional self-protection. The avoidant's internal story may have been, "I am fine on my own. I do not need this connection. I can walk away whenever I choose." But your silence introduces a different reality, a reality where they notice the empty spaces you used to fill, a reality where they remember the moments of comfort, understanding, and emotional safety they experienced with you, a reality where they begin recognizing that what they lost was not just a person who was available, but a person who genuinely saw them. That kind of loss can be difficult to process because it forces them to confront the cost of their own patterns. The slow withdrawal, the emotional distance, the hesitation to fully open, the habit of protecting themselves even when there was something valuable in front of them. Your silence does not create the grief. The grief was already there. Your silence simply removes the distractions that allowed them to avoid feeling it. And in that quiet space, they may finally begin facing the truth they spent so much time running from, that the connection mattered, that you mattered, and that losing access to you carries a weight they never expected to feel. Silence does not create these feelings because it is some kind of strategy designed to trigger a reaction. That distinction is extremely important. Genuine silence is powerful because it removes the distractions that allowed the avoidant to continue avoiding what was already there. When you were still reaching out, when you were still trying to maintain the connection, the avoidant had something to focus on. They could concentrate on managing the distance between you. They could decide when to move closer and when to pull away. They could measure how much vulnerability felt safe and how much emotional space they needed. They could remain occupied with observing your reactions and adjusting themselves around the relationship. But when you stopped, all of that disappeared. There was no longer anything to control, nothing to balance, nothing to monitor, no emotional pattern left for them to manage. There was simply the empty space where your presence used to be. And in that quiet space, the feelings they had been keeping at a distance begin to rise, not because your silence forced them into grief, but because your silence removed the constant activity that helped them stay away from it. I want to talk now about what happens after this internal collision, what the avoidant often does with the embarrassment, the frustration, the grief, and the uncomfortable realization that they may have needed someone they spent so much time convincing themselves they did not need. Because their response often follows a recognizable pattern. The first reaction is usually to create even more distance. This may seem confusing. From the outside, it can look like proof that they do not care. It can look like they have moved forward without difficulty. It can appear as though your absence has made no impact at all. But this is one of the most misleading things about avoidant behavior. When their emotions become overwhelming, their instinct is often to return to the very thing that has always helped them feel safe. Separation, more independence, more emotional walls, more reminders that they can handle everything alone. They may throw themselves into work, routines, distractions, or anything that allows them to maintain the image that nothing has changed. But that outward appearance does not always reflect what is happening internally. The person who suddenly becomes even more distant is not necessarily someone who feels nothing. Sometimes it is the opposite. Sometimes it is someone who feels more than they know how to process and is relying on the only emotional protection they have practiced for years. Distance becomes their way of regulating emotions they do not know how to hold. The stronger they appear externally, the more effort it may be taking internally to maintain that appearance. Eventually, though, distance cannot completely silence what has been lost. After the first wave of withdrawal, many avoidant people enter a period of reflection that they did not intentionally choose. It happens quietly. It happens during moments when their usual defenses are weaker, late at night when the world becomes still, early in the morning before distractions begin, during ordinary moments when their mind has enough space to wander, and that is when memories start returning. They remember conversations, they remember small details, they remember the moments when they felt understood, accepted, and emotionally safe. They remember the way you looked at them, the way you listened, the way you noticed things about them that other people overlooked. They begin thinking about the unique experience of being truly seen by someone. And then another realization begins to appear. They start connecting the dots between what they had and what their own patterns created. They begin seeing the cost of the distance they created, the moments they pulled away, the affection they withheld, the opportunities for closeness they avoided, the cycle of moving toward connection and then retreating from it. This reflection is not always comfortable. It is not some dramatic moment where everything suddenly becomes perfect and clear. It is often quiet, private, and painful. It is the experience of looking at the consequences of your own choices and realizing they carry more weight than you expected. That is the true humbling. Not pretending to be sorry, not performing regret, not creating a temporary emotional display to pull someone back in. Real humility happens internally, when a person finally feels the impact of what they have done and can no longer hide from it. But now I want to bring the focus back to you, because while understanding what may be happening inside the avoidant can give you clarity, your healing and your growth cannot depend on their reaction. Your silence was never supposed to be about controlling their emotions. It was never meant to be a weapon. It was never meant to be a calculated move designed to make someone finally recognize your value. Some people may use silence that way, but the silence that truly changes everything comes from somewhere much deeper. It comes from exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that develops when you have spent too much time carrying the emotional responsibility for a connection that was supposed to be shared. It comes from reaching the point where continuing to chase, explain, wait, and hope costs more than accepting reality. It comes from the moment when you finally realize that protecting someone else's comfort cannot continue to come at the expense of your own peace. That moment is not a tactic. It is a transformation. It is the point where you stop building your life around someone's inability to show up and start building it around your own worth. And the message your silence sends is far more powerful than any argument could have been. It says that you understand your value, not just as an idea, not just as something you repeat to yourself when you are hurting, but as something you live, something you embody, something you are no longer willing to negotiate away just to maintain access to someone who is unwilling to meet you fully. And this is the part that may surprise you. Beneath the discomfort, beneath the anger, beneath the private moments of grief and reflection, there may also be something else happening inside the avoidant. Respect. A deeper respect than they expected to feel. Because self-possession is something avoidant people often admire. It is a quality they may have built their entire identity around. The ability to stand alone. The ability to not depend on others. The ability to remain emotionally independent. And then they witness you doing something they were not expecting. You choose yourself, completely, quietly, without trying to punish them, without trying to prove anything, without begging them to understand. They created distance through inconsistency, mixed signals, and emotional walls that repeatedly appeared and disappeared. You created distance through clarity, through peace, through self-respect. And that difference matters. They may not admit it, they may not show it, their external behavior may remain unchanged for a long time. But an experience like that is not easily forgotten, because you did not fight for control, you did not chase after someone who was running, you did not turn your pain into a weapon or your love into a plea. You simply reached the point where you understood your own worth and stopped abandoning yourself. And in that moment of stopping, you communicated something more powerful than words ever could. You showed them, and you showed yourself, that your love was valuable, your presence mattered, and your life was never meant to revolve around convincing someone else to choose you.